and they they picked you to fix it, so to speak, and you agreed to take on this challenge, and you were successful. You were very successful with this. I'm just gonna give a little overview of your story for those who were not here. We talked about. Well, I asked the question. I said, Mike, how did you gain the trust of these people? I was meaning the employees after this place was about to be bankrupt. I'm a person working there. I'm like, well, I'm out of here. I don't want nothing to do with this. There's no money. There's nothing. And who's this guy going to come in and fix this? How can I trust that? Trust you? Trust the system, so to speak. And we talked about this, and you said you gave us a synopsis of the power of trust, leadership, and the power of trust. We got really deep into that about how much power the word trust, not just the word, the action of trust. Because I found out, I found out for the first time that trust is not earned. Trust is just something that you give or receive. Someone makes the choice to trust you or chooses to trust. And because all my life I've said the same thing, as many of you have. You might not admit it, but you got to earn my trust. And Mike, you gave an awesome story of how trust is not earned. So we're going to talk more on trust. I'm going to give you the mic, Mike, to go ahead and then get into this trust thing a little more. And as I had spoken to you earlier, there's a trust and there's a distrust. So this thing is going to flip a little bit. So, ladies and gentlemen on the panel, I have the honor, the pleasure, and the blessings of introducing to you guys and presenting you guys none other than Dr. Mike Armour. I'm interested in hearing all that you have to say, sir. Please take the floor.
Well, thank you, Cloyd. It's great to be back with you. I apologize for a bit of a soft voice today. I took some medicine that my vocal cords did not like, so okay. I may be a bit softer in my comments today. Not the content, but the delivery. It's interesting that you teed up our conversation the way you did, bringing distrust into the picture. Because I actually got into the writing that I've done on trust because of distrust. When I started my leadership development firm in 2001, we very quickly were working with some very large dynamic companies and partnerships, some in the Fortune 100 category. These companies would often bring me and my team in to work with some issue that seemed to be a productivity or efficiency or communication problem. Things were bogging down somehow, and they thought they had put their finger on it. They wanted us to come in and help them turn that situation around. But after a few of these engagements, I began to notice a recurring pattern. We would start peeling off the layers of that onion, that problem that they had presented, and almost inevitably, down underneath there, what we would find were either unrecognized, unaddressed, or unresolved issues of distrust. And when we would put those issues on the table and deal with them frankly, forthrightly, and constructively, the problems they brought us in to deal with began to resolve. They began to take care of themselves because communication opened up, collaboration opened up. People were not afraid to share things they had held back in reserve for some time. People quit guarding their turf so much because they no longer were suspicious that others would take advantage of them if they were fully transparent about what they had been thinking or had been doing. And so it was seeing that pattern of distrust and seeing the revolution that happened in those organizations when we began to restore trust that led me to write the first draft of the book, Leadership and the Power of Trust. Wrote it in 2005 and published it in 2006. Little did I know that within the next 10 or 12 years, I would find myself in the middle of working with pronounced distrust on a global scale in some of the countries of Eastern Europe and Africa. In particular, Russia. That was the first episode because I had been working with challenges in Russia for a number of years. Because I've got a background in military history and diplomacy academically, because I'm a retired naval intelligence officer and worked the Russia problem throughout my career, a nonprofit here in the United States asked me to become their advisor. It was a pro bono engagement on how to carry out some work they were doing surreptitiously under the nose of the KGB in Russia. This organization had been started by a group of very idealistic college students who, after graduation, went to Vienna and began trying to plant churches in Europe. They were, because Austria was a neutral during the Cold War, a lot of refugees from Russia were coming their way. And as they would talk to these refugees, they began to discover that the Russian government, after the Communist Revolution, set out systematically to destroy any evidence of Christianity, any influence of Christianity, and any presence of Bibles and Bible-related material in the entirety of Russia, even to the point they would send people to the gulags or to prison if they surreptitiously hid a Bible from the authorities. These idealistic young people felt like they were called to try to do something about that. And so they raised the money to set up a printing operation in Vienna that would allow them to print Bibles in easily disguised forms. They looked like packages of cigarettes or something else, things they could slip by the border guards, and they would then smuggle surreptitiously Bibles in these disguised forms back into the Soviet Union. They had been doing that for about 25 years when they asked me to become an advisor and consultant with them. And I began to speak at some of their fundraising events around the country. We became more and more involved. Well, out of that, when the Iron Curtain fell, I became really involved because now then they no longer had to smuggle. By then, they had smuggled something like 800,000 Bibles into Russia. They were a force to be contended with. They were courageous, they were innovative, they were imaginative, and they had been terribly successful. But now then, with communism gone, they no longer needed to smuggle. So now then, what is their mission? And I was helping them redefine what is our mission now that the communist regimes are collapsing all over Europe. And that led us to start going in and doing exploratory work to figure out what were the things that we could use our resources to service now. What we ran into was one of the most unique things in the history of Christianity, and the production of a book on my part that has the most unique history of any book in the history of Christianity. Because in Russia, during the Tsarist era, character training was the province of teachers, not parents. It was teachers who were charged with instilling character in their children. And because Russia had a Christian oriented culture, they based that character curriculum around Christian values, Christian virtues, Christian principles. When the communists came in 1917, they wiped all of that out. They still wanted the teachers to teach character, but they gave them a communist ideology to teach in place of the old character curriculum. And then the communists began to destroy, as I said, any semblance of the Bible itself or anything that praised Christianity, Judaism, or biblical values. Now then, that communism suddenly was lifted, the teachers wanted to get back to the old way of teaching character, because they could see that the corruption in their country was so rampant that no one trusted anyone. There was no social fabric left. In fact, I've said to people that by the time that I started working this project in Russia, there were only two values left in the country. One was the value of family, and the other was the value of survival. You were willing to bend any rule, break any norm, violate any ethos in order to survive and take care of your family. And so that whole moral and ethical core that had once defined the Russian people had been crushed under the heavy heel of communist dictatorship. These teachers wanted to get back to the principles that had given them a strong moral fiber as a nation at one time. They were up against this distrust that was everywhere. Their young people were growing up distrusting everyone and every authority, every institution. But the problem was, if they were going to get back to those old biblical roots, they had nothing to work with. The communists had destroyed all the Bibles. They had destroyed all of the literature that was related to Christian and Jewish ethical outlooks on life. And so they made a request of me if I could develop a series of character studies based on biblical characters that they could use as study materials in their character classroom experiences. My wife and I worked together. She wrote most of that material. I formatted it. We raised a lot of money, distributed hundreds of thousands of copies of this in provinces of Russia, because the ministries of education were working directly with us to make this happen. The man who was spearheading it on the Russian side was a man named Vladimir Skovorodnikov, Minister of Education for one of the largest regions of Russia, the deputy director of the National Association of Ministers of Education in Russia. He and I got to be steadfast friends. I traveled a lot with him in Russia. He traveled a lot with me here in the U.S. raising money for this effort. And he came to me a short while later and he said, "Mike, we've created a dilemma. We've got this curriculum. Everybody is excited about it. But when the teachers begin to teach about these biblical characters in their classroom, the students start asking questions. And many of these teachers have never seen a Bible. None of them have ever read one. And they don't know how to answer these questions the students are asking. As a result, it's embarrassing to them, and they're beginning to resist teaching the curriculum. We can't let that happen." So he said, "This is what I need. I need a book 225 to 250 pages long that is written for people who have never seen a Bible before, but in that length of material, introduce the major themes and timelines and concepts of the Bible, especially its ethical core, to someone who's never touched a Bible, never opened one. And we will use it as a textbook in our high schools and our universities, and we will use it to train our teachers so they can begin to answer these questions." And he said, "Could you provide that for me?" And I said, "Sure." I thought this was going to be a simple thing because I just thought we've got lots of good introductions to the Bible in English. I'll get some author to allow us to translate his or her work into Russian, and we'll be up and running. But after 6 months of investigation, I discovered that the book he wanted had never been written, because every book, even the best introductions to the Bible, presumed you knew the vocabulary, presumed you understood Christian terms, presumed you knew the basic stories of the Bible. There was nothing that started at ground level zero, assuming a reader who doesn't know biblical terms, doesn't know biblical stories, doesn't know anything about the Bible other than it's a banned book. Okay. And so I took 6 months and wrote that book. Today, there are 2.5 million copies of it in circulation in 22 languages. It was adopted as a textbook in colleges, universities, and high schools in several regions of Russia, across the entire nation of Ukraine, and in Romania. As I said, it's now in many languages, 22 the last time I counted. Many of them no longer Eastern European languages. It's in languages like Farsi and Arabic, because one of the things I did, knowing that the book was going directly into Russian translation, and having studied Russian history enough in my PhD program, I understood the challenge many times of taking concepts in English and putting them into Russian in a way that was closely aligned with the English meaning. There was too much opportunity for what I wrote to get mistranslated by a well-intentioned translator who simply chose the wrong term in Russian or an abstract English term. So my decision was very little abstraction and no idioms. We don't use any figures of speech. We write this in plain, simple language that easily translates without you having to find an equivalent in your culture of a concept in someone else's culture. It turned out that strategy is why the book has gone into so many languages, because it's easy to translate into any language that's out there, because it doesn't present anyone with the challenge of understanding our idiomatic expressions in English or unique terms that we use in English culture that doesn't have really an equivalent in those cultures. That then leads me sort of back to where you started. The first the first challenge we had with an abstract English word was with the word integrity. There was no Russian equivalent for the word integrity. Can you imagine what happens to a culture that doesn't even have a word for integrity?
Wow.
We would use the word integrity in a manuscript, and then when we would get their translation, they had translated it with the Russian word for honesty. To them, that was integrity. But the other things that we talk about in terms of integrity, having good standards, having the right standards, living consistently with those standards, being the same person everywhere you are, no matter what you're doing, no matter who is watching, I am consistently true to my standards. Those ideas were completely foreign to the Russians. And so one of the things that then happened was that I had to start going over and teaching seminars for the teachers, 100 to 200, sometimes 500 at a time for a full week, helping them understand the concepts surrounding a society that builds on integrity and trust, because both concepts were completely foreign to them.
Wow. Mike, let me ask you this. We stop you for 1 second. I'm gonna ask, man, this is awesome stuff. What was the name of this book?
The English version, we eventually put it in English because so many people here who were providing money for us to put it in schools of Russia and Ukraine said, I'd like to have that in English. The English title is A Newcomer's Guide to the Bible.
Mm-hmm. A newcomers.
Yeah, because it was written for people who were such newcomers, they had maybe never even opened one up. And we wanted to communicate in the title that it was there. And yet, ironically, because it is written so simply and so concisely, I've had people who have been Christians for 25, 30, 40 years who've come to me and said, the simplicity made some things clear to me that I had never understood before. I really grew by reading this book. So in some ways, the term newcomers has been a bit of a marketing challenge because, mature Christians think, well, I don't need that. I'm not a newcomer. But it's amazing to me over the years, and it's been in print now 20 years. It's been amazing to me how many people that are really good students of the Bible had never put things together in the way that they did after they worked through this book.
Is it available to us?
Yes, it's available on Amazon, along with something else that we wrote. When we started using it in the schools, and it was being taught in the classrooms, then adults in Russia and Ukraine wanted to have copies themselves, but they were not having the benefit of teachers and a classroom to help them really get grounded in the material. So they said, can you provide a workbook that we can use for self-study? So I wrote a workbook that is also available in English. If you go to Amazon and search for A Newcomer's Guide to the Bible, it will offer both the workbook and the book itself in a combination package. And rather than go and search, I'm actually today, it's interesting we're having this conversation. I am today, just today, brought up a new website for that book alone. I've had it on other websites, but I've created a website called mynewcomersguide.com. It's not finished yet, but the homepage is functional. And if you go to mynewcomersguide.com, there is a link there that will take you directly to the page on Amazon where you can order. So you don't have to go searching for it on Amazon. The website itself is minimally functional right now. The menu links don't work. I've just been focused to this point on getting the homepage ready, but the rest of it will be completed within 2 or 3 days. Mm-hmm. And we'll have a support pages behind it that promote the idea.
Beautiful. I'm gonna go grab both the workbook and that book. I see, Laz, you have your hand up, but I have a question first.
Okay.
How much danger were you in? Because you are in no longer communist regime, but the mentality, just because you took that away, the communism, the mentality is still there. These people are still under the same mental state, per se. How much danger were you in implementing this type of thing that, as you said, that communism was totally against? These people were going to jail for even having a Bible in it, for hiding a Bible or whatever. So when you come in and you're in a whole different country than what you're used to, how much danger were you in, do you think?
Well, there were times that I might have been flirting with danger. For one thing, I was extremely careful because I had been a naval intelligence officer for 25 years. The KGB knew who I was. And everything in Russia was bugged. KGB operatives were everywhere. When communism fell, 185,000 men and women discovered that their spouse was a KGB operative, and they had never known it.
What?
Okay, can you imagine? That, in fact, one of the things that's was really interesting to me was that most people live in high-rise apartments there, Very few people ever have the money or the right to own a private property. And so they live in these apartments. And outside these apartments were all of these little garages, little sheds that were garages. But no one can afford a car in Russia for the most part. Only the elites have cars. And I couldn't figure out, why do they have those garages? But I also noticed that when I'd be walking back to where I was staying from a day's activities, there were always clumps of men sitting around the mouth of one of these garages playing cards or just swapping stories, having a drink of vodka or whatever. And one day I asked my host, I said, Nadia, what is the reason for all these social gatherings around there? And she said, everybody knows that's the one place the KGB has never bugged. They can talk freely there. And they gather there because
Wow.
it's the one place they can talk openly and honestly.
Wow.
So that's what I mean about distrust. You don't distrust, you distrust everybody
Everybody.
except your own family. And then you discover you've got spies in your own family. Okay.
Wow.
Until you have seen what communism did to that nation, you cannot imagine the deterioration of just healthy human relationships that resulted after 3 generations of that. And it happened to a lesser extent in Ukraine. The Ukrainians were independent enough in their mindset. They fought back on more of it, but it was one of the curses of Marxism in Eastern Europe.
Wow. That's amazing. Lazaro, I see you have your hand up.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yes.
Awesome. Hold on. Let me just get my camera on for a second. Hello. How's it going?
Okay. Good to see you
Awesome.
again.
I wanted to ask Mike, so given your decades of experience when it comes to government, education, and more in both the United States and Russia, I wanted to ask, what can you say as, from a firsthand perspective behind the scenes, how have the relationships between, the United States and Russia, how has that evolved over time? From a first person perspective, you know what I mean? Because I'm sure you've seen a lot of behind the scenes stuff and have gotten, firsthand information throughout the Cold War. And then even now when it comes to, the Ukraine war and things like that.
Well, it has evolved, and it's good that you ask the question of how that has changed. And I can tie my answer to you back into the answer that I gave Cloyd just a moment ago, and never quite finished the answer that his question deserved. He asked me about, did I ever feel like was it in danger? I was careful enough and guarded enough that I never really felt threatened by the authorities. But what I did feel threatened by came later, when there was for lack of a better word, a reversal of opinion toward Americans. When the wall came down, people were eager to talk to Americans, to go to seminars provided by Americans, to have them in their homes. They were eager for American books, American movies. In the first few years after communism fell, the Russians just received us with open arms. But then I put this blame on Hollywood. Hollywood started shipping to Russia movies that we couldn't play in theaters in the United States. And I'm not talking about an occasional one. They shipped a bunch of absolute garbage. The Russians, after watching that for a while, decided what they saw in those movies was the way the Americans really were. Remember, they didn't trust government. They didn't trust their own officials. And they suddenly decided, well, we can't trust the Americans either. Look how they really live. Look at all their crime. Look at all of their gangsters. Look at all of their sordid values. And so then there was actually a resistance movement that began to build against what we were doing in the schools because it was American indoctrination, and those Americans are a morally rotten bunch. If I could sum it up, that's what it was. And so the last trip over, I really did have confrontations and was about to be declared persona non grata. And so I just quit going. That's when I turned my focus more to Ukraine. But in Novosibirsk, we had a group that was upset that stormed into our training and began to intimidate the participants, came up on stage, were yelling in my face. The next day, the man who was responsible for the facility and was a retired KGB operative went and got some of his retired buddies. And when I showed up the next day to start the sessions, all these gardeners were working, planting flowers and digging in flower beds. And I just happened to say to my translator, wow, they certainly got serious about sprucing up the landscaping around their building. And she said, look at their waist. Every one of them had a gun on his hip. She said, that's ex-KGB. They are there to see that these guys don't get back in. The next week, I was in Tomsk, and again we were invaded. And front page of the newspaper, a slurring attack on me, and I was trying to let this corrupt American culture slip in through the seemingly friendly mechanism of teaching Christian values. I mean, it was the biggest hit piece that I've ever been subjected to. So that was when I started feeling the threat. But that also answers your question, Lazaro. How did the attitude start changing? And basically, the people we got to know and be good friends with who trusted us and trusted us when we said what you're seeing in the movie theaters, what you're seeing in the magazines that are being distributed here from some sordid presses in the United States, that's not who the majority of Americans are. They believed us, but today there's real suspicion outside the areas where they interact with a Christian Americans a lot, such as St. Petersburg, Moscow. Once you get beyond those areas, you find that people are just as suspicious of us as Americans as they ever were during the Cold War.
Wow. You speak something about today, and so I want to ask you a question about if you know today how much has it changed, or is there still some resistance and some pushback on the Christianity in Russia?
The pushback is anything that is not Russian Orthodox. There's a strong cultural backing for the Russian Orthodox Church, and therefore people are frequently hesitant to accept anything having to do with religion unless the Russian Orthodox Church has blessed it. Unfortunately, I had that blessing early on, but and I had a real close relationship with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The patriarch himself and I were acquaintances. But in Russia, that began to erode. And there are evangelical groups that are doing very well in Russia. They've continued to take advantage of the opportunities there. But Russia began to do such things as if you were an American missionary, they are a missionary from any conservative Christian or evangelical group, you had to leave the country every 6 months and you could not come back for 6 months or a year. They would give you a 6-month visa, but then you had to leave. So if you went in there, you had to get something up and going very quickly that could survive your being taken out of the picture. So many times it's not open opposition. It is just making it so challenging for you to work that it's discouraging, to say the least. But there are people who've risen to that occasion, shown great courage, great determination, have really stuck with it. And there are pockets in which a very familiar form of Christian ethics is still burgeoning in Russia.
How received? How received is your book? This book that you wrote, a newcomer's guide.
Mm-hmm.
How much received is that book today?
I don't know in Russia because I don't have close friends any longer who are working there on a regular basis. And the ones that I am somewhat acquainted with are really working in St. Petersburg and Moscow. And those are different cultures from the heart of Russia where I was doing my work. It's hard for us to imagine the sheer size of Russia. It's 11 time zones. So you have people going home for dinner in Eastern Russia at the same time people are still going to work in Western Russia.
Wow.
It is almost too big to govern. And so you have all of these subcultures that are working at work there. And the further east you go, the more those subcultures ignore Moscow. In fact, I was talking about the requirement that missionaries leave every 6 months. One of my friends was working along the Ob River, which flows out of the Altai Mountains north into the Arctic Ocean. And he was going in, he had to register every 6 months and had been required to do that for some time. But when this new law by the Duma was passed saying, now then you don't have to register, you have to leave. He went in for his next round of registration and he said to the woman who was taking care of his paperwork and who had become a pretty good friend, how is this new law going to affect me? And she said, what law? And he said, the law that the Duma passed regulating missionary activity. And she said, what law? And he said, the law that says that I have to leave every 6 months. And she cleared her throat and looked him in the eye and said, what law? He finally got it. And then she said, they pass a lot of silly laws in Moscow. So those missionaries who had that protective government focus locally, and there was a lot of that because the missionaries brought in so much benevolent assistance and food and clothing and opportunities for people that the government was not providing. A lot of the people who've been able to thrive and survive is because they had the appreciation of local officials who ran cover for them.
Thank you for that, Mike. That's good stuff. Veronica, I see your hand is up.
Hi, Mike. How are you?
Doing well.
So now as for like the media, they don't always share stuff with us. Like even in school, we don't learn all these things, and it's, you want to know about them, so much we find out unless we're interested. So as for the media, during this time, did they share everything with the world that was going on, or was there a lot of stuff left out?
Part of the challenge for the media is that they tend to be focused in European Russia. That is, again, St. Petersburg, Moscow, Rostov-on-Don, Volgograd, those cities in European or Western Russia is where the media goes. And one of the reasons that people go there is many people, if not the majority, can speak English because they are part of European trade, and European trade now is done in English. And so the educated people of Russia tend to study English if they are in Europe. Now, if they're in Siberia, if they're out along the Ob River, where I was doing a lot of my work, they take Chinese because they're trading with the Chinese. They're not so good in English. That being the case, our media gives you the European slant on Russia, not the full slant. And the Russians play to that. In the war with Ukraine, Putin has recruited very few people out of European Russia. He's recruited people from the minority groups in Asiatic Russia because they don't have any political clout. And they're thousands of miles away from Moscow. They can't put together a demonstration and march on the Capitol. And so even the political figures bifurcate the country and treat Europe different from the way that they treat the rest of Russia. And so if you only are in Europe as a news person covering Russia, you're going to get a different slant than the one that I was getting, given the places and the people that I was working with.
Thank you for that. How long were you there, Mike?
I was in and out for about 7 years. By then, Ukraine was really taking off. We had such a reception in Ukraine. My first trip in, they asked me to address the National Academy of Science, talk about what we were doing and the impact it would have. And pretty soon we were teamed up with people in the cabinet. I mean, it was top level sponsorship of the initiative we were bringing, because the Ukrainians are a different people in terms of spirit and outlook from the Russians. The Russians are not only a suspicious people, partly justified because they have been so mistreated in the 20th century by their own government and their own officials, but they're very pessimistic people. I was always amazed to find someone who was really an optimistic Russian. Optimism is everywhere in Ukraine. They are the most innovative people that you could ever imagine. In fact, the day before the Russian-Ukrainian war started, I posted a podcast, not knowing that the invasion would occur the day after the podcast aired. I posted a podcast by saying, everyone's predicting that if Russia comes in, the war will be over in 10 days to 2 weeks. I think we're going to all be surprised. The Ukrainians are the most imaginative, innovative people I've ever known. The world's going to be surprised at the innovation that they bring to this and their ability to offset the stodgy, clumsy structure of the Russian army. And that's exactly what has happened. Our Pentagon now is learning from the Ukrainians how to use drones in warfare. The Ukrainians are now manufacturing drones and selling them to nations all around the world and sending teams in to train them in how to use them. They have become the strongest army in Europe right now. They're stronger than the Russians.
Wow.
The Russians can outlast them in terms of manpower, but just in terms of what's happening on the battlefield, the Ukrainians are much more adept, much more imaginative. And part of it is because that innovative spirit, they empower people to take initiative. Russia does just the opposite. It is so, leadership is so fearful of revolution that everything has to be controlled at a very high level of decision making. So even on the battlefield, a lieutenant or a captain leading a group of troops cannot take advantage of an opportunity or respond to a threat that occurs suddenly and unexpectedly on the battlefield without it going all the way up to a colonel somewhere for him to personally sign off on it. And so many times the Russians lose great opportunities or get themselves surrounded needlessly because they couldn't get a decision from up the chain of command soon enough. That's not the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians if you're there and you see the opportunity, strike. if you see the enemy coming, get up and move and outflank him. I mean, it's just a different mindset.
Right. Thank you for that, man. Karen, you have a question. I can't hear you. What'd you say?
Hi, Dr. Mike Armour.
How are you?
I am fine. I wanted to know, because I'm sure it was really intense, how were you able to navigate through the bureaucratic corruption? I mean, I know you spoke about your naval intelligence experience. How, with that experience, were you able to navigate through all of that?
Well, I think for one thing, I always went out of my way to communicate great respect for every Russian I met, even the ones who were unprincipled, because there's a lot to admire in the Russians. You will never deal with people who are better read than the Russians. It was one of the challenges in the seminars I was teaching. The questions would come from all kinds of directions, from all kinds of books, many of which I had never even been exposed to, because the Russian winters are so harsh and so long, and people are generally so limited in the money they have and what they can buy, that they spend their winters reading. And I'm not talking about reading junk. They are reading the best authors. You will see a dump truck driver queued up to go in and offload a load at a construction site, sitting there reading a book. And if you walk up and look at the book, it's probably by Tolstoy or it's by Solzhenitsyn. They read good stuff. And as a result, they are very knowledgeable. And I have a great admiration for the mastery that they have. One of the greatest opera houses I've ever seen in my life is in Novosibirsk, out in the middle of Siberia. And it's packed every night with people wanting to go to the opera. Wow. It's a nation of such interesting disconnects. And so I always communicated respect for them and respect for their rules and respect for their institution. I also made it my priority to very quickly start identifying the people whose judgment I could trust about how do I approach this person? Do I even approach this person? Do I even raise this issue? Or do we finesse around it some way? And I was fortunate enough to have some people early on who, for instance, the woman in whose apartment that I stayed when I was over there had 5 PhDs. She was the first professor of English in the history of Siberia. She went to Joseph Stalin in 1952 and convinced him that English was on the verge of becoming the language of international commerce. And he needed more people who could speak English if he was going to take advantage of the world economy. And he gave her permission to go to Oxford and study to get a PhD in English literature. Very brave, very visionary kind of woman. Went on and got 4 other PhDs before she was through. The last one in computer technology. People like her knew the West. Her daughter had come to the United States and gotten a degree. Her grandson came to the United States and got a degree. They knew the West. They knew what was dangerous for me, what was not. And so I surrounded myself with people like that who were very rare, but when you could find them, you could trust what they said was wise or unwise in the actions you were considering.
Thank you so much for that, Mike. I see Tony Curtis. So he said In the chat, said the Ukrainians sent their children and women away to protect them as much as possible.
Yes.
That's correct.
In fact, one of the real challenges that we face now, and I've got good friends, people who worked with me in Russia from here in the United States, are now working with Ukrainian refugees all through Europe because millions of women and children left Ukraine thinking this war would last a few weeks or a few months. Now then, those children have been in European schools in Poland and in Denmark, in France, in Italy, some in North Africa. They have been in schools for 4 or 5 years, learning another language, learning another culture, and becoming more like those citizens than Ukraine. And the real question now is how many of those women and their children will go back to Ukraine, especially those whose husbands have been killed in the war. So there is a population challenge coming up for Ukraine after this war is settled, because not only have they lost so many people to life-changing injuries for which Ukraine has no facilities. They do not have rehabilitation capability, even in the most mundane sense of the word. They are going to have a lot of crippled people. They've lost a lot to death. And then they've got all of these people who've left, who've established themselves somewhere else, have thriving businesses other places. They have no reason to come back. So I'm concerned about how that's going to play out.
Wow. That's going to be hard.
Yep.
TC, Tony Curtis, I see you have your hand up. Go right ahead.
I want to say this for the Ukrainian women that I have met. They miss home, one.
Yes.
And two, I think it was a smart strategy to send them out because it gave them financial resources that they sometimes use to get
Right.
back home. Since the soldiers that I know that are still there, because the men couldn't leave Ukraine,
Right.
they all had to stay. They don't have any resources. The medical is, very limited. And then the soldiers, they're basically in camps, right? And they move together and live together, but like all of the resources are being heavily leveraged. And so they actually, by getting the women out, they gave themselves some economic stability by
Yeah,
allowing
that's
the
true.
women to leave with the children, right?
Right.
Instead of forcing the young sons or the babies to be stuck there in Ukraine, to send them back to rebuild. Right. I work with a number of Ukrainian women that when they come, our services, I have a group that I've been working with. The doula services go in and support them because the women have to give birth alone. But
Right.
they have every intention of supporting their men, their fathers, their cousins, and that are
Right.
still there. So it actually gives them a bit of financial stability.
Yes, one of the things that I think this war has demonstrated, and that surprised everybody except those of us who had been working on the ground for a number of years before the war came, is that in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine found nationalism. Keep in mind that for hundreds of years, Ukraine was controlled by somebody else. The Ottomans, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, even Lithuania for much of the time. Poland, there are sections of Ukraine where the language of instruction in the schools is Polish. And the best preserved examples of 18th century Polish architecture in the world is in Lviv, Ukraine. So they were very fragmented. They didn't have an identity as Ukrainians. But that began to gel after the Soviet Union fell. And when Russia attacked, not only did it gel, it got set in concrete. They have this loyalty to their nation and one another that is extraordinary. And you're right, they will find ways to support the ones who are on the front line. The people I was talking about a while ago that are less likely to go back And this even includes some of the older families who were old enough that the men could leave, are the people from the Donbass region, which is what Russia has taken over. It will take 25 to 30 years to rebuild Donbass. These people have nothing to go back to. Their entire village is flat. There's not an apartment in their building in their town that is intact. They have very little to go back to. And that's where I think we're going to see a challenge in people returning. And of course, they won't return if Russia ends up getting the Donbass in a peace settlement, because none of them want to live under Russian domination.
Right. TC, you have your hand up.
I know, because this is, these my kind of favorite topics right here. So
I understand.
As I listened to this, I was thinking about this, even though I don't want to tell my age because I ain't that old, but I am old enough to remember the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, right?
Right.
As we kind of watch them, if we look at it the other way, it became a unifier, right? Because they were still trying to figure out that identity while they knew what it was. It wasn't until the USSR fell, right? And it gave them that more sovereignty with this direct attack. And I'm just speaking from working with them and then, of course, putting the history into context. You look at places like when colonialism left Africa and they were pouring, France and things was pouring concrete in the plumbing to keep the nations from ever becoming sovereign. I don't know if you ever really lose that fight when someone takes something so important from you. They don't really give up. I think they would go back, but I think they'd go back with a different strategy. They thought they were secure because, honestly, I think they thought that the world would see their struggle and support them, and they didn't. They stayed out of it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. The question of, how many will go back and how enthusiastically will they go back has a lot to do with how much rebuilding has to be done after the war is over. Even if the Ukrainians are able to get Donbass in the peace settlement, there is not a coal mine in eastern Ukraine that is operative any longer. And coal was the lifeblood of eastern Ukraine. And everywhere you went, there were coal mines. Many of my best friends and closest colleagues were coal miners. And yet there's no livelihood there. And the best estimates I've seen is that the least damaged mines will be 5 to 10 years before they can be restored to production. They were not very efficient and not very technologically advanced to begin with. Now then they've been bombed into oblivion. And so the whole issue of how long will it take a country that is totally impoverished to rebuild basic infrastructure is going to become a real issue. And there's a point at which patriotism alone won't be enough to drive some people to return and face the long-term hardships that lie ahead for that country, however this thing ends.
That's going to be that's going to be huge trying to rebuild that.
You've got to keep in mind. You've got to keep in mind this war has gone on longer than World War II did.
And they said it's going to be 10 days.
Yeah. It's amazing, and the destruction that. Here's one of the differences in philosophy, and it's why the destruction is so great. The Russians operate off of a philosophy that the way you win a long-term war is to destroy the morale of the people. And the way you destroy the morale of the people is to destroy their homes, to destroy their schools, to destroy their hospitals, to destroy their infrastructure, their power plants, their water plants, their sewage plants. And so that's what Russia has been targeting. Russia has targeted very few military targets. They have been targeting what we would call civilian buildings, civilian civilian entities, and so it's not like the war is over and we go back home to our apartment. There is no apartment. There's no apartment
Right.
for blocks and blocks and blocks. And keep in mind that there is no history of private ownership even in Ukraine. Communism didn't allow people to own private property. So the place that you were staying in was not your place. It was a place the government provided for you.
Wow.
Now, who's going to rebuild that so that you've got a place to live? You don't have the money to do it. So it is it's a very, very difficult challenge.
Yes, it is. Wow. Well, Tony, I see your hand is up for the sake of time. Is there anyone else who has a question or a comment before we say goodnight? Want to let Tony? Go ahead, Tony. We'll let you go ahead and get your question off.
What I'll say is that, you know, the spirit of people, I get that it's been destroyed, but this is the same move that was done all over colonial Africa. And it was done to the African Americans as well, right? Every time they go somewhere, build a city, build independence, right? It would get destroyed. So it's not a new tactic. The question is, with having a global market to work from, where coal mining was the primary, with what you describe them as is their ability to use drones and technology, could that be the thing that helps them rebuild their infrastructure and save them from this war and destroying their people?
Well, the thing that they have proven themselves adroit at are things that have to do with small technology. I mean by that, things that are in small packages. Reopening a coal mine that has been shut down calls for major equipment. Let me just sort of give you an idea of the simplicity at which they lived even before the war began. I traveled a lot in western Ukraine, out around the Carpathian Mountains. That is magnificent wheat growing country. When you look at the Ukrainian flag with the blue in the top and the yellow in the bottom, that is meant to symbolize those stretches of Ukraine where when the wheat is in its golden stage and the sky is clear and blue, it looks just like that flag. And it does for miles and miles and miles and miles. And they're harvesting the wheat with hand scythes. In all of my travel in western Ukraine, I saw 2 tractors. Everything was done by hand or ox-drawn plow. They were living in the 18th and 19th century at the time that I quit going over. Now, they began to mechanize more after I was there so much, but still, they had a long way to go. We would do retreats with groups up in the Carpathian Mountains at ski lodges, and in the summer when the ski lodges would make their space available to us for a very reasonable fee. And every morning you would see the parade of 10 or 12 farmers heading up the mountainside with their hand scythes over their shoulder to go harvest some crop or harvest hay on the mountainside. So I understand. I'm a firm believer that the spirit of people can overcome a lot of things. But when you keep in mind that Ukraine is larger than any other nation in Europe, it's larger than the European section of Russia. It is an immense place to rebuild. And I think it's going to take a world that responds to them with real sacrifice financially to help them get back on their feet in a way that they can build the big industry, the heavy industry that they're going to have to survive.
that being said, we thank you so much, Mike. You are a plethora of knowledge and wisdom, and as just Karen has applauded, I applaud you, man, and I thank you for being here. The panel here, you guys are awesome all the time. I love you guys, man. Be here. We're gonna get some more here on Let Your Voice Be Heard Talk Radio. This is a history lesson here, right? You told me stuff. This is a history lesson, and there's also things for today. I think next week we might get into another one of Mike's books, perhaps. We'll get into some more of Mike's travels, Mike's things that he has been through. I see you, Karen, saying buy the book. Yes, I'm going to buy that book, and I'm encouraging each and every one of you to buy that book. Mike is awesome. He's awesome, and I love when he's here. He's going to be here with us for a few weeks, so we're going to take advantage of you, Mike, and get as much out of you as we can. Wring out the rag and get as much out as we can. I told you before, I said, if you just saw how many notes I had, you might send me a bill, man. I'm only jewels you got. But thank you guys for being here. We love each and every one of you. Come back next week. It's your boy now.
Step in, lean in, mic on, and begin. Hey! Been quiet too long, chewed up tongue, turned down songs, clock keeps ticking on the wall, but your name's still missing from the roll call. Let your voice be heard, say every single word, from the low notes to the sky, your hands up high. Let your voice be heard, loud, clear, undeterred. If it shakes the room, that's how you know it's you, yeah. Oh, yeah. You got a truth tucked deep in your chest, heartbeat tapping out, say it, confess. Crowd might stare, let them do what they do. They never held a fire living in you. Let your voice be heard, say every single word, from the low notes to the sky, your hands up high. Let your voice be heard, loud, clear, undeterred. If it shakes the room, that's how you know it's you, yeah. Speak up, name your dream out loud. Stand up, you're the leader of this crowd. One spark, one shout, watch the silence melt. Power in your mouth is the truest thing you felt. Let your voice be heard, say every single word, from the low notes to the sky. Throw your hands up high. Let your voice be heard, loud, clear, undeterred. If it shakes the room, that's how you know it's you, yeah. That's you. That's you. Step in, lean in, mic off.
It's your boy now.
Recording stop.